You know how it is when everything seems fine, but you have that feeling, that weird little thing in the back of your mind that tells you something isn't right? You try to ignore it, to move on, but that feeling insists on not leaving. Now imagine this happening in a house where you are completely alone, taking care of everything. Just you, the noise of the house, and that strange feeling that you are not really alone. Well, that's exactly what happened to me, Maddie, when I accepted a job as a nanny in a house that, at first glance, seemed normal. The place was big, with 2 floors, a nice garden in front, and a strange feeling that I couldn't explain. At first I tried to ignore it. After all, it was just another job, right? But you know when you walk into a place and you feel like something is out of place, even if you can't see it? That's how I felt every time I passed through the basement. The basement was at the end of a long hallway with an old, creaky door. Every time I walked by I had that feeling of being watched, like something or someone was waiting. And the smell, it was strange, a little bitter, like old food you forgot in the back of the refrigerator. The house dogs, 2 large and normally brave labs, refused to come down the stairs that led to the basement. I thought it was strange, but I tried not to think about it too much. That's when the noises started. At first there were just creaking sounds, like the old wood in the house was settling. I thought that was normal for an old house. But as the night went on, the noises started to get clearer, more defined. It was almost like someone was walking through the basement, dragging something along the floor. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, or maybe the wind hitting the windows. But deep down I knew it wasn't just that. One night, after the kids were asleep, I was on the couch in the living room, trying to distract myself with a movie. But suddenly I heard a different sound. It wasn't just a creaking or the wind. It was a shuffling sound, like something heavy was being moved in the basement. My heart started beating faster and I felt that chill run down my spine that warns you not to go any further. But at the same time, there was a part of me that couldn't resist. I needed to know what was going on down there. I grabbed the flashlight that was in the kitchen and, with my heart in my mouth, I walked out into the hallway. The basement door was ajar, which was strange because I was sure I had closed it earlier. The sour smell was stronger, almost making me nauseous. With the flashlight in my hand, I slowly opened the door and the creaking of the hinges seemed to echo throughout the house. I walked down the first few steps and the air grew colder with each step I took. The dogs, who always accompanied me, stood at the door growling softly, but they didn't come down. Downstairs, the basement was completely dark, even with the light from the flashlight illuminating the way. There were boxes piled up, old furniture covered with sheets, and that heavy silence. But then I heard it again. The shuffling sound coming from deep in the basement. My heart raced, but I kept walking slowly, trying not to make any noise. As I got closer to one of the speakers, I realized the sound was coming from behind it. I gripped the flashlight tighter, and with my other hand, I pushed the box to the side. And that's when I saw it. In the darkest corner of the basement, there was a figure. It looked like a man, but something was wrong with him. The skin was too pale, and the eyes, they were empty, lifeless eyes. He was crouching as if he was waiting. When the flashlight light reached him, he slowly raised his head, and a terrifying smile appeared on his face. I froze. I couldn't move, I couldn't scream. It was like my whole body was paralyzed by fear. And then he started moving toward me, slowly, shuffling his feet across the cement floor. The sound was the same one I had heard before, the sound that brought me here. Suddenly, one of the dogs barked loudly, breaking the silence. That was enough to snap me out of my trance. I turned around and ran as fast as I could towards the stairs, feeling the cold air on my back, as if the thing was right behind me. When I reached the top of the stairs, I closed the door and locked it immediately. The dogs continued to growl and bark, but nothing else happened. I stood there, leaning against the door, trying to control my breathing, trying to convince myself that it was all just a nightmare. But even now, every time I think about that house, I can hear the sound of feet coming from the basement, and I feel a chill running down my spine, as if something was watching me, waiting for the right moment to appear again. I never went back there.
I hope you liked the story, because the second story is even more chilling. Just don't forget to see if you're already subscribed to the channel so you don't miss any terrifying stories.
Just imagine. You live your life peacefully, not worrying about anything but your daily routine. Everything seems normal, but suddenly something changes. It's not a visible change, but you feel it. A chill in the air, a feeling that something isn't right. Maybe you've felt this before, that feeling that you're being watched, but when you look around, there's no one there. It's uncomfortable, isn't it? Well, that's exactly how it all started for Matty. Matty was an ordinary, run-of-the-mill guy. He worked as a programmer at a local company, had friends, went out for fun on the weekends, and, like many, enjoyed a restful sleep. But suddenly, his nights started to be disturbed by dreams. And they weren't ordinary, run-of-the-mill dreams. They were nightmares so vivid that he would wake up sweaty, panting, with his heart racing, as if he had just escaped from something terrible. In these nightmares, Matty always saw the same scene, a dense forest, full of tall trees that blocked out almost all the light. The atmosphere was oppressive and he felt trapped in a maze with no way out. In the middle of this forest was a boy. He had a sad look, dirty and torn clothes and, worst of all, he was crying out for help. His voice echoed in Matty's mind even after he woke up, as if it was engraved in his soul. Every time Matty woke up from these nightmares, something stranger happened. He noticed marks on his body. It started with small scratches on his arms and back, but over time, the marks grew deeper, and they began to appear on his neck, as if invisible claws had tried to strangle him during the night. Matty was scared. He began to doubt himself, wondering if he was doing this in his sleep or if there was something more sinister at play. The days began to pass. Matty couldn't concentrate on work. His mind was always focused on nightmares and unexplained marks. He sought medical help, but the doctors found nothing wrong. With no answers, Matty began searching for alternative explanations. He spent sleepless nights researching dreams, ghosts, and supernatural theories. Everything he found only increased his anxiety. Nothing seemed to fit perfectly with what he was experiencing, and the feeling of being haunted by something invisible only increased. On one of the busiest nights, Matty found himself sitting in the living room, with the lights off, staring out the window. The full moon was shining outside, illuminating the room with a cold, silvery light. Suddenly, he saw something in the reflection of the glass. A shadow behind him, motionless but clearly present. He turned quickly, but there was nothing. The chill came back with a vengeance, and Matty knew that whatever it was closer than he wanted to admit. That was when he started hearing stories around town. He was at a local bar, trying to distract his mind with small talk, when one of the older patrons mentioned something that caught his attention. Decades ago, a boy had mysteriously disappeared. He was around 8 years old and was last seen playing near the woods outside the city. Despite searches, the body was never found. The story became legend and many believed that something from the forest had taken the boy. Some said he was still there, lost among the trees, waiting to be found. Matty felt a chill run down his spine as he heard this story. The boy from his dreams was the same age. Could it be possible that the spirit was trying to communicate with him? And, more importantly, what did he want? Determined to find out the truth, Matty began to investigate the case of the missing boy. He visited the old house where the boy had lived, now abandoned and in ruins. The windows were broken and the front door creaked when opened, as if protesting the presence of anyone who dared to enter. The inside of the house was dark and damp, filled with mold and dust accumulated over the years. Yet, even in that dark place, Matty felt a connection. It was as if the boy's spirit was trapped there, waiting for someone to free him. On one of the walls of the house he found an old black and white photograph. It showed the boy with his parents, with a shy smile. It was the same face he saw in his nightmares. But what bothered him most was the expression on his parents' faces in the photo. They looked tired, as if they already knew that something terrible was about to happen. Matty's nights became more disturbing after that visit. Now, in addition to the nightmares, he began to hear whispers. Low voices which echoed throughout the house, calling to him. He tried to ignore them at first, but each night they became more insistent, until he began to hear the boy's name, Tommy. The voices called Tommy, as if they were trying to reach him on the other side of an invisible barrier. Knowing that he needed to do something to end this torment, Matty returned to the forest where the boy had disappeared. He took a shovel with him, determined to find some clue. It was a cold, cloudy evening, and the silence in the place was so intense that he could hear his own breathing echoing through the trees. The further he walked, the denser the forest became, as if he was being drawn into the heart of something ancient and forgotten. It was then that he saw the marked tree. It was a tall tree with thick bark and roots that seemed to hold the ground tightly. On the shell was a strange symbol, something Matty couldn't decipher, but it gave him a deep sense of unease. He knew this was the place. Matty began to dig, his hands shaking from cold and fear. With each shovel of dirt he removed, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Finally, his shovel hit something hard. He carefully removed the dirt, revealing an old wooden box, covered in moss and almost disintegrated by time. With shaking hands he opened the box and found the objects that would change his life forever. Inside the box were children's toys, already worn by time. A teddy bear missing an eye, rusty metal cars, and at the bottom, a picture of Tommy. The same boy Matty saw in his dreams, now smiling innocently, as if nothing bad had happened to him. But there was something else in the box. A small journal with yellowed and worn pages. Matty opened it and began to read. The words written by a shaking hand told the story of a boy who was afraid. Afraid of something that came in the night, something he couldn't see but felt. Something that whispered to him in the shadows and made him tremble with terror. And, on the last page, the words written with strength and desperation, "It found me." Matty knew at that moment that Tommy's nightmare wasn't over. The boy's spirit was trapped between the two worlds, unable to rest. And now he had turned to Matty for help. But there was more. Something dark, something much older and more powerful, was behind it all. A force that fed on fear and pain, and now it had its eye on Matty. That night, Matty returned home, but he knew he would never be the same. He wasn't alone. He could feel Tommy's presence, but also the shadow of the entity that haunted him. The nightmares came back with more intensity, and now, Matty saw not only the boy, but also a shadowy figure, always lurking, always waiting for the right moment to strike. In the silence of the early morning, Matty woke up with a strange feeling. The room was cold and he felt a weight on his chest. When he opened his eyes, he saw Tommy's figure beside the bed, but this time he wasn't calling for help. His gaze was empty, his eyes black as night. And then, Matty felt a cold, skeletal hand grab his neck. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The shadowy figure that had haunted his dreams was there, finally revealed. A creature made of darkness, with no defined form, but an overwhelming presence. It loomed over Matty, absorbing his fear, his pain. And in that moment he knew there was no escape. Whatever was chasing Tommy was now chasing him. In the days that followed, Matty disappeared. His apartment was found empty with the windows open.
I hope you liked the story, because the third story is even more chilling. Just don't forget to see if you're already subscribed to the channel so you don't miss any terrifying stories. I hope you liked the story.
Have you ever found yourself in a situation that starts out so normal, but suddenly leaves you with a weird feeling it's the worst? That feeling that something is out of place, but you can't quite put your finger on it. Let me tell you a story that happened to me, that to this day makes me wonder if I was being paranoid or if there was actually something more going on that night. It all started when my friend asked me to take care of his dog while he was traveling. His house was in a super quiet neighborhood, one of those where you barely hear any noise at night and the street lights almost never flicker. A safe place, you know? So I happily agreed. His dog, Max, was a big, friendly Labrador, the kind of dog anyone would love to take care of. The first night everything went as normal. Max and I watched a movie in the living room, he slept next to me on the couch, and I stayed up late without a care in the world. But the second night something changed. I was lying on the couch again, playing with my phone, and Max was lying by the living room door, quiet. Very quiet. Suddenly he started growling, a low but firm growl that made all the hairs on my arms stand up. I looked at him and noticed his eyes were fixed on the front door, as if he was seeing something I couldn't see. My first reaction was to think he was hearing some noise outside, maybe a cat or some other animal passing by on the street. But when I went quiet, I heard nothing. Just the gentle wind shaking the trees. Max continued to growl and I slowly got up, trying not to make any noise. I went to the window next to the door and looked outside, trying to see if anyone was there. And that's when I heard it. A knock on the door, soft but insistent. It was almost like someone was testing me to see if I was home or if I was going to ignore them. My heart raced. Who could be knocking on the door at this time of night? I looked through the peephole and there he was. A man in his 40s, dressed in ordinary clothes and a worn cap. He didn't look like someone dangerous, but there was something in his eyes, something that made me hesitate before opening the door. I slowly opened the door and pushed it open just enough to look outside. The man smiled, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was a smile that didn't reach his eyes, that seemed more forced than genuine. "A good night," he said in a low, soft voice. "I'm looking for a man named Marcos. Does he live here?" I frowned. I didn't know any Marcos, and this was my friend's house, not mine. I explained that I was just house-sitting and didn't know anyone by that name. The man stood there, still, looking at me as if he was waiting for something more. The silence that followed was awkward, heavy. I felt the air around me grow thick, as if something invisible was pressing down on my shoulders. Then, without thinking, I said the first thing that came to mind: "This house has cameras everywhere." As soon as I mentioned cameras, the man's smile disappeared. He mumbled something I didn't quite understand and took a step back. "I'm sorry, I think I made a mistake," he said, before turning and walking down the sidewalk, disappearing into the darkness of the night. I quickly closed the door and stood there, leaning against it, trying to understand what had just happened. Max was still fidgeting, pacing back and forth, as if he sensed something was still wrong. And honestly, I felt it too. That strange feeling didn't go away. Even after the man left, the air inside the house felt heavier, as if there was a presence I couldn't see. I spent the rest of the night awake, listening for any sound, waiting for something I didn't even know what it was. For days afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about that man. Who was he? What did he really want? And why did I feel that chill running down my spine when I looked into his eyes? To this day, when I return to that house to visit my friend, I can't help but look out the window, hoping to see that shadowy figure again. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe the man really was looking for someone. But deep down, I always wonder, what if he was looking for me?
Tell me which story made your hair stand on end? Tell me which one you liked the most? Because in the next video, the story is even more chilling. Just don't forget to see if you're already subscribed to the channel so you don't miss any terrifying stories.